Hello, my name is Bruce Gillette, and depending on where you are, good afternoon, good evening, good morning. This is covering 9 different time zones, and we're very happy to have all of you with us. We'd ask that the participants please mute themselves so that we can have a good quality of recording. This is a gathering of people from a variety of churches and ecumenical groups within the Reformed tradition. I'll share with you a little Presbyterian trivia. I love to share the fact that that name Presbyterian is an anagram, and if you rearrange the letters in it, it spells something else. Some of us work very closely with other traditions. If you take the letters in Episcopal and mix them up, it spells Pepsi-Cola. Many have attended colleges in the United States. The lodging for college students is called dormitory, and you mix that up and it spells dirty room. Well, if you mix up the letters in Presbyterian, it spells best in prayer. If you add an S to that, the anagram Presbyterians plural spells Britney Spears. But let's go back to prayer, and rather than a Presbyterian one, I'm going to share with you a favorite one from Pope Francis. And this is part of his On Care for the Common Home encyclical that many of our churches studied. Let's begin this webinar with a word of prayer. Let us pray. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect the life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty and not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in the struggle for justice and love and peace. We pray this all in the name of the head of the church, our Lord and our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. We are very thankful to have all of you here, and special thanks to those across the ocean that are joining us. We are blessed to have Valerie Brown and also Adrian from the Church of Scotland. Rue is here from the United Reformed Church in the United Kingdom, and Philip Peacock is here from the World Communion of Reformed Churches based in Germany, but with membership of around 100 million Reformed Christians, Presbyterians around God's world. We are going to ask each one of them to share for about 15 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions and answers from all of you. And we'd ask, when we get to that time, to raise your hand in the Zoom, and that will put you at the top of the screen. So let's start off. I show my bias because of my ancestors for our 2 presenters from the Church of Scotland. Please take it away.
Hello, good afternoon from sunny Scotland. My name is Adrian Shaw. I was the climate change officer for the Church of Scotland from 2007 till 2020. And during that time, we were working with congregations across Scotland of all denominations, encouraging them to become eco-congregations, which there are now nearly 600 across Scotland, to take action on the environment in worship, practical action, and advocacy. And that was going very well. In about 2013, people began to raise questions, particularly young people in the Church of Scotland, about why, if the Church of Scotland is saying we should be doing all these things, do you continue to invest in oil and gas companies, Total, BP, and Shell? And those questions came to a focus when Bill McKibben came and spoke in the Assembly Hall of the Church of Scotland. It wasn't to the General Assembly, but he spoke in that same venue where the General Assembly meets. And young people at that time really began a significant campaign saying the Church of Scotland must sell its shares in these companies. Well, I was in the middle between the young people on the one side and the Church of Scotland Investors Trust on the other side. And we just met them, and they didn't like the idea, they didn't like the principle, they didn't like divestment. They said they could engage through the financial company that managed their assets. They really didn't want anything to do with it. However, the debate went on. It dragged on for some time, and it was agreed from a working group bringing the two sides together to put a report to General Assembly. That went to General Assembly in 2018, and there was a bit of a rumpus about that, and various people spoke against it, and eventually the vote was lost. The vote on divestment was lost by 300 votes to 135, with one or two significant speakers, including a former moderator, who said this is really not the way to go. Now, that was a difficult moment, but the campaign continued, and a report returned to General Assembly in 2019, at which there was some procedural shenanigans took place, which upset a few people. And again, the vote was lost, this time by 303 votes to 265. And there was uproar at that point. There was a protest within the Assembly Hall and protest outside. And a formal motion of dissent was signed by 40 people. We were pretty sure we would get it through, third time of asking in 2020, but then lockdown happened. The pandemic came, and in 2020 I moved on to do other things relating to the COP. COP26 came to Glasgow in 2021, and really divestment kind of got squeezed out because everybody's attention was on the COP. At that point, when the General Assembly reassembled in 2021, we were somewhat surprised to see that the Church of Scotland Investors Trust announced they had disposed of their shares on financial grounds, that they no longer considered these shares to be a useful asset. Well, given the income generated by oil companies, subsequently they got that wrong. But we were pleased that they did that, even though they did it without any real reference to the arguments that had been put forward. I'd bowed out at that point and given over to Val. But I think just in conclusion, before I hand over to Val, reflecting what did we learn from that rather bruising experience. One thing was clear, we couldn't argue with the investors in terms of finance. We couldn't say to them that you should be investing in renewables, because they had all the arguments, all the data, all the jargon to say, no, we know best. It was essentially an ethical argument that we had to say, we have to change because it is the right thing to do. But reflecting on that is a very big ask, because that suggests that a whole part of our financial ethos has been essentially wrong. And to use an old word, sinful, that we are investing in things we really ought not to have done. And to confront people with that is necessarily challenging and difficult. That one was one reason it was so painful. Val, however, has brought a new and much more diplomatic edge to this. So I hand over to her now.
Thanks, Adrian. Yes, so the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland decided to set up a special commission to look at ethical investment much more broadly than fossil fuels, and I was handed the somewhat daunting task of looking after that. So I'm Val Brown. I work for Christian Aid in my day job, but I'm an elder of the Church of Scotland, and it was in that capacity that I was asked to do this. And it was a small commission of sort of 7 people from across the breadth of the church. And I think we all felt that at that point we'd been handed somewhat of a poisoned chalice. And we could very easily have spent those 2 years that we had to report just trying to define what ethical meant, define what green meant, define what clean meant. But instead, what we did was we started speaking to other churches, other sort of like-minded groups, to see what they did with their investments, to try and see if there was an obvious way that we could work with the Investors Trust. Now, the Church of Scotland are in a kind of unique position in that our investors' trust are set up by an Act of Parliament, and so they are not bound by any decision that the General Assembly makes. They are bound by trustee law. So their starting point would have been, our duty is to make sure that we get a good return of investment for the people who are investing in us, which are mostly but not exclusively local churches and the central church. They're also all volunteers, so there's no paid staff member there supporting them. And so in conversation with them, what we were trying to do is say, well, how do we do this together? Because what we don't want to do is keep having these fraught, unhelpful conversations on the floor of the Assembly. The reason that they were fraught and unhelpful is because largely there was a lot of misinformation as well. It was, people saying that if we disinvest from fossil fuels, everybody in Aberdeen will become unemployed. There was also the sort of age-old, well, it's hypocritical for us to disinvest in fossil fuels because we're driving petrol cars. Some of our churches are fueled by oil pumps because of where we live. And so what we were trying to do over the course of those 2 years was to find enough information about this so that we could actually then go back to the Assembly and say, let's take this back to basics. What does it mean to be church? What does it mean for us as people of faith to want to do with our investments? How do we make them as good as they can possibly be without being silly and risking any investment, but also making sure that we gave people all of the information to say, actually, if we disinvest from a fossil fuel company, that company is not always necessarily harmed, potentially reputationally, but not financially, because somebody else may buy those shares. And being very honest about, yes, there are electrical vehicles, but then there are supply issue chains with them. But also looking at the very broad exclusions that the Church of Scotland currently has. So we've got the exclusions on alcohol, gambling, pornography, tobacco, but we have a 15% limit on that. And so making the General Assembly very aware that that doesn't then stop us investing in companies which can be making billions of pounds worth of income from those sectors. It just happens that that particular portion of their business is so small that it still falls below the 15% cutoff. And so what you could be in that position of not investing in, for example, a Scottish craft gin company, which may very well have very good employment practices, but you could invest in a large supermarket, even though they would sell a lot more monetary value of alcohol in any given year. And so by sort of laying that out and addressing the sort of fossil fuel conversation head on, what we were able to do was to work with the Investors Trust to get an agreement that what we would do is set up an ethical oversight committee, which would say, let's look at the investments intelligently. We completely get that the Investors Trust will always have the final say in this because of their Act of Parliament. But how do we look at these issues, discuss them in a helpful manner, and then work with investment managers to make sure that what they are investing in is something which reflects the aims and values of the church. And that's kind of where we've got to. And we've been working with Faith Invest, which is an American organisation. They've been super helpful in actually bringing everything together, showing us what other churches have done, and helping us put together what's called the front door language, which we framed around the 5 marks of mission to say, what as the Church of Scotland do we want to do? If you were to come to the Church of Scotland and say, what are your investment principles? There currently wasn't really anything that could be there. So if we start to put flesh onto the bones of these 5 marks of mission, how then would an investment manager be able to see very clearly these are the things that the church are interested in, and it gives them a steer. So we're still very much in the formation part of that, but what we've managed to do is bring that conversation probably into a slightly more helpful forum, where people can get round the table and say, right, well, how do we look at these, accepting that broad exclusions have their place, and we're probably in a position where we don't want to invest in fossil fuel companies, and it's unlikely that that will happen again, but we haven't actually said that is a policy. It was done as Adrian said, it was done on financial grounds, and on the back of that, there was then an agreement in place that they wouldn't reinvest without broader agreement from across the church. So what we now need to do is have these intelligent conversations and say, well, we don't maybe want to preclude the entire energy sector if there are companies which are showcasing good practice and are putting a significant amount of investment into renewables. But equally, we probably don't want to go back to having a fossil fuel investment. But at the moment, if you look at our portfolio, while we're not invested directly in any fossil fuel company, we are directly invested in banks who are facilitating fossil fuel development. So there's still that bit of a tension there, and we need to get to a place where we're very clear on the investments we hold, why we hold them, and what we want to do. That's going to be the tricky part of that conversation. But I think having this ethical oversight committee and the General Assembly being able to hear from the ethical oversight committee rather than hearing from parts of the church which before probably didn't have much power to do anything about it has been a helpful starting point. So we're very much at the start of this journey, and we're still learning from friends across different church and church-based organisations. I think that's probably us at 15 minutes. So Bruce, I will stop there.
Bruce, please unmute.
I promise we will come back to you. I have some questions for you, along with, I'm sure, many other people here. I'm grateful for both of you sharing. We'll move to your friend to the south. Rue, are you in London? Where exactly are you based?
Yes, that's right. I'm in London. It doesn't look as sunny here as it does up in Scotland, which is quite amazing. It looks very nice up there. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay.
Sure.
And there'll be a lot of text will come up on the screen. I'm not expecting anyone to be able to read all of it. And if you do want to see the slides afterwards, I'm very happy to share them. But there will be some text there that takes you on a potted history of the joys of our own General Assembly resolutions, as we call them within the URC. So my name is Rue, and I'm the head of public issues for the United Reformed Church. United Reformed Church is quite a young church. It's been going since 1972, and it was formed by the Union of Presbyterian churches and Congregational churches in the UK. Not all of them, and there's been a sort of a merger of various churches along the way as well. But that unique history that we have of churches coming together means that we also have quite a unique polity, and that changes how we do things in our church a little bit from perhaps how it is with you in the PCUSA. But yeah, let me just take you through a lovely journey through some of our better moments in our General Assembly, if that's all right. I'm going to go to 2019, which is scarily 5 years away. And we had a resolution there, which is kind of the moment for us where we had made our official decision that we would disinvest or divest from fossil fuels. And it's significant for us in that it was a mission council meeting, which is kind of our meetings, which happened in between General Assemblies, and they were also of equal worth and equal importance, but usually with a smaller group of people than our full General Assembly would be. But it was seen to be an urgent matter for us, which is why we put it to our Mission Council back in 2019, rather than waiting for the next General Assembly to come around. And it was that urgency with which it was received by the Mission Council. And that's why we were very pleased to get it through in 2019. They could have deferred it to the next Mission Committee, or the next General Assembly. But it was deemed that this was something of such importance that we wanted to approve it and make it happen as soon as we could. So that was in 2019 when the resolution was passed and agreed. And in that, you can see at the bottom there, it talks about refocusing the church's investment portfolio by scaling up investment in renewable energy and clean technologies. And that's the starting point for us, I suppose, on that journey. We're still on that journey. And certainly all of the things that we've resolved to do here, we're working through those. But the first one, I suppose, for us was one of those things which we had discussed for several months, which was around at what point should they be classified as fossil fuel companies and so on. And I really appreciate what Val and Adrian were saying as well about that. And we had decided then that 10%, total turnover of 10% derived from extraction or supply of fossil fuels, including thermal, coal, natural gas, and oil. And we felt that that was a good enough for us kind of measure. And I realized that there are always going to be moments where we need to sort of reassess and reevaluate these things and look carefully at companies that might change that percentage of derivation from those things, and that might change too. So we wanted to be flexible enough, but this was enough for us, given the importance of the issue, that we felt it was good enough for us at that time to really seize this opportunity to do the disinvestment. So they also resolved to do all these other things as well. And you'll see at letter G there, that was to encourage URC synods and local URC churches with investments to divest from those. And so the polity, just to explain how it works within the URC, we have a General Assembly, and it has limited power, really. It's people coming together to make some big decisions that General Assembly will agree to. But actually on matters regarding the local church is preeminent there, and local congregations make their own decisions. And when we have regional groups as well, which are called our synods, and each regional group is almost like a mini General Assembly or a mini church house. So they also replicate a lot of what we do in our church house in London. A lot of that happens regionally as well. So really our powers are limited at our General Assembly level. And what we usually do is have some language like we strongly urge or we encourage rather than demanding. We don't do that, and we can't do that in the URC. But what we quite often try and do is to show by example at General Assembly level, at national level, and then hope that local churches, local congregations, and synods will follow suit. Sometimes that works very quickly, other times it takes a bit longer, and they will also have the freedom to make decisions for themselves and to work through the issues and how that applies to them in their local context, which we really appreciate. And it seems to work for us, although it can make things a lot slower to roll out than perhaps sometimes we would like at a national level. 2020, our Mission Council there, we didn't have a General Assembly for 2020 reasons, but we had a Mission Council that online in the later part of 2020. And this was something that came through from our Youth Assembly. And our youth are really important to us in the URC. They have a voice, they are invited to speak, and they have full voting rights. A couple of representatives from our Youth Assembly at our General Assembly. And they meet every year in Youth Assembly to work out they call them motions at Youth Assembly, and they work out which of those motions they'll take forward to General Assembly as resolutions. And then we support them in that and develop those resolutions so that there's something that people can engage with at our General Assembly. So our youth voice is really important to us. And they were the ones who asked us to declare a climate emergency. And so that was brought to our Mission Council, and it was agreed in 2020. So the URC has declared, like many other churches as well, that there is a climate emergency, and therefore we must act on it. 2022 was when we were able to say in our press releases that all of those synods, our local areas within the URC, had actually done what we had modelled at General Assembly level, national level, which was to divest from fossil fuels. And we were really delighted that in the gap of 3 years, even with a pandemic and so on in the middle, that in those 3 years, there had been a move across the whole of the URC to embrace this and to take it really seriously. And we were actually a little bit surprised, to be honest, that it happened so quickly. Things like this don't often happen at that speed, but this was one of those cases where it seemed to connect with people, and many of the synods reflected very similar structure and very similar kind of regulation to what we were saying at General Assembly level as well. So we felt it was a good sign that we had done okay at General Assembly level, that they had been implemented then locally as well. I want to just mention, if it's helpful, some other kind of similar issues for the URC that they've had over the years. As I mentioned, we were only formed in 1972, so it's still a young denomination, but 2 years in, they were wrestling with apartheid in South Africa and what to do about that situation. It's not altogether disconnected and unconnected with what we're talking about, because they were struggling with what to do with their money. And it was, a case where there was so much frustration and anger and pain, and people wanted to do something, and there was much wrestling about what to do. And so Assembly had decided that they would still invest, but they would be careful in their investment in what they did in South Africa, and they would be looking for opportunities to create change and to support those who were in need in South Africa. They felt that withdrawing their money completely would be completely the wrong move. And so they wanted to still be investing, but to be investing in the right things. 79, so just a few years later, we had this request that the officers of Assembly would write to all banks in which the URC has shares to request them to halt loans to the South African government and its agencies. So we had realized in the space of those few years that there was much more that we needed to do, not just about selective investment, but about stopping some investments and refusing to do those, and actually thinking about at banking level what we could do there. And we were hopeful then that that would create some kind of move within our banks as well to be aware of the issue. The reason why I've mentioned all those is because we really did wrestle with what we were going to do about fossil fuels. Like many of our churches as well, who were thinking about climate crises and thinking about the very nature of the needs that there were, we wanted to have a voice. And so we had kept investing in fossil fuel companies, thinking that, as shareholders and as people who were investing our money there, that they might listen to us. But actually there was a growing discontent that there was no sense of any kind of listening at all. And so an organization in the UK called Operation Noah had a campaign, had a project called Bright Now, which was really trying to seize this energy and this discontent from churches and bring them together for a louder voice. And so we were one of those churches then that at that time responded to this call from Bright Now and Operation Noah to do something drastic, something that would actually have an impact and would allow us to have a voice. We had felt quite voiceless, even though we were investing millions in these companies, but had not really seen much return on our investment in terms of them actually listening to us. And so with other churches and other organizations, we set about a coordinated campaign, which was in social media and also at our General Assembly level. And you can imagine these things take a long time to construct. And for different churches, they move at different speeds, wheels within wheels. Things take a long time. But on this issue, it seemed that there was quite a lot of traction quite soon, and a lot of things just came into alignment at around the same time, which was just remarkable and an answer to prayer, where our churches did decide that we would disinvest. And it was a moment for celebration. And we felt that it would have a bigger impact at that stage to not have our money in those organizations than to try and keep speaking out within those organizations. The results now, after all of that, all those discussions, machinations, changes of heart, decisions that we were making and prayerfully and slowly and carefully, is that now in 2024, one of our investment companies that we work with has been introducing a very tailored approach to investment. So it's a particular fund which aligns itself exactly with all of our ethical investment policy. And our ethical investment policy covers things like weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, those kind of things, as well as what Val was talking about as well in terms of tobacco and other issues as well. And that ethical investment policy has now been named the URC fund, so they've named it after us, which is something we didn't really want. It wasn't about that. We didn't really want to be named for it, but actually it was just, a huge sort of pat on the back for us, I guess. It was a huge encouragement for us that investment companies were taking this seriously, that they had actually heard our voice, and that they were trying to create something which would fit exactly within the ethics that we were espousing and others were espousing. So that's where we're at now. As Val said, we're still on a journey of discovery around this. We're still honing this and learning from this. I think the thing we're working on at the minute really is how can we afford a just transition in terms of our churches. Many of our churches still are powered by gas, and that heats our buildings, and other options are being looked at, and they're very expensive, and some of them won't work for some of our churches. So churches are really in that stage at the minute of thinking about, yes, ethically, we've done a good thing in terms of our investments, but that's just the start of it. There's so much more to do now as well. Okay, I will end it there. Thank you very much for listening.
Bruce, unmute, please.
I'm listening to myself, encouraging you all to mute, and I forget to unmute. Now we're going to have Philip Peacock from the World Communion of Reformed Churches, who brings us truly a global perspective on this, and we're very grateful for him being able to make time for us. Take it away, Philip.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. I would like to begin by saying that we as a global communion are in a very different place as far as our member churches are concerned. And this is for several reasons. The two most important ones, however, is that as a global communion, we have way less money than several of our member churches. As a global communion, we don't own any property. We rent the offices that we even are in at the moment. And because, for various reasons, we don't have that much of a core budget. This means our investment portfolio is much smaller than our member churches. Which also means, therefore, that there is less of scrutiny on how we make our ethical principles for investment, as perhaps the member churches are. Perhaps also our governance structures allow for us to do things a bit differently. However, having said that, I mean, I know that Bruce introduced us, but I would like to just add to this a bit. We are a global Christian communion that brings together those who belong to the Presbyterian, Congregational, Reformed traditions, but also United and Uniting churches, as well as those who came out of the First Reformation. And I specifically speak here of the Waldensians. Being a very Protestant global communion, we are very, very much rooted in the idea of justice. All of you here who are part of our member churches definitely know this. And because of this, we root ourselves in what we call the Accra Confession. The Accra Confession was a document that emerged in 2004, 20 years ago, actually, and we're going through a process of celebrating these 20 years, from our General Council in Accra in Ghana. Now, the Accra Confession is a very special document because it sees justice as a matter of faith. And it names neoliberal capitalism as being, well, we don't use these words, but we name it as contributing to the deep economic and ecological crisis that we are in. We didn't go as far as to say it's a heresy or a sin, but we named it as being responsible for the economic and ecological crisis that we are in. We come from a place, therefore, where we see economic justice as an issue of faith. We see that economic activity and the ecological crisis are intimately connected with each other. Therefore, as a matter of principle, wherever there is discussion on the ecological crisis, we raise the economic question, which we believe is at the root of this crisis. And at places where there's discussion on economics, we raise the ecological crisis. We recognize now we are in the midst of climate catastrophe. We are literally at a point where, even if we make reversals, we are not going to be in a healthy place even going forward. We recognize that governments, those who make policies, have let masses of people down. And I want to place this as the space from which we make our decisions. Now, having said this, I also have to admit that I am not the finance person in the WCRC. I'm the justice person. And I have to also say, thanks to us, in a way, credit to us, this has not always been at odds with each other. However, if you go on to ask me a little more difficult questions about finance, I may not be the right person to answer them. Having said this, I want to come to our ethical investment policy. Now, our policy was revised in 2019 in our executive committee. Very interestingly, our policy originally in 2015 and 2014 drew from the PCUSA's General Assembly's values of social economic consideration, with theological, social, and economic consideration with regard to ethical investment. And so it did three things, right? Shareholder advocacy, community investing, and screening, both positive and negative. So we had a policy already which was in place, and we had investments done by three spaces, one of which was, of course, the Presbyterian Foundation. As far as I know, that has come to a very specific closure now. We don't have money there anymore, but there are other avenues we are opening up with the Presbyterian Foundation. We work with a German bank called the KD Bank, and we used to work, and so we follow their ethical guidelines as well, and we used to work with the Barnabas Foundation, but perhaps no longer money is there being invested with the Barnabas Foundation as well. So our 2015 policy already, this already was out there, which said, had 9 set of criteria that was further amplified into 7 criteria for countries. So we say that there are company-specific criteria, but there's also country-specific criteria about where we can invest. And I'll go through all of them for you. Firstly, of course, no investing in companies that have weapons and weapon systems, violate any of the 5 core labor standards, that's child labor, forced labor, discrimination, freedom of association, the right to collective bargaining. So, that's another thing. Seriously violate environmental laws or generally accepted minimal environmental standards, produce nuclear energy, produce genetically modified plants and animals, produce alcohol or tobacco, though there's, like someone says, there is a 15% or 10% limit on the alcohol thing, produce pornography or sex tourism providers, have demonstratively conducted research on the human embryo or on embryonic cells, and of course, produce or promote fossil fuels. Okay, that was clearly said already in our 2015 policy. And then it went into very specific things with regard to countries. Now, with regard to countries, I won't go through all of them. There are 7 criteria here, but criteria C is whose climate protection services are classified as very poor according to the German Watch Climate Protection Index. In 2019, what we did was we took this policy and we renewed it again, making very specific criteria now. So in the inclusion, so we said there are exclusion criteria and inclusion criteria. In the exclusion criteria for companies, we actually now specified what we mean by fossil fuels here. We said companies producing coal or oil from oil/bitumen sands and oil shale, or providing significant reserves of these raw materials. So we very much specified it over here. We we say companies, therefore, who also themselves or whose suppliers systematically violate environmental laws or generally acceptable environmental standards. But we went even further now with this. We said funds of church investors should, on principle, never flow to the budgets of countries that significantly go against church investment guidelines, especially when and there are three things here: act as warmongers, violate human rights, and three, endanger creation. Again, in our positive criteria, we have preferences for companies that further develop the application of regenerative energy sources. It's not a must, but say preference for this. And we also say now that there's a preference for countries that conserve creation, and we use two indexes: the Climate Risk Index of German Watch and World Development Indicator, Deforestation and Biodiversity of the World Bank. Now, in 2019, unlike has been explained by my colleagues from the Church of Scotland and from the URC, we really didn't have any questions about this. This was just accepted as it was. The executive committee was all on board with this. We didn't have a difficulty with passing this ethical investment policy at all. So it passed without any debate, which then, of course, leads, and I will close with this, leads my treasurer of the WCRC, who is in fact behind both of us worked on the ethical guidelines policy, to say that the only place we can actually invest our money in is in Scandinavia. There's no other country in the world where we can invest money anymore. So this is where we are. Thank you.
Bruce.
I just want to remind everyone some of the latest science news, which is motivation for why we are doing this. On June 6th, NOAA, which is the major scientific organization in the US government, issued a simple statement of the drastic state we are in. One of the major drivers of exceptional heat building within the Earth's atmosphere has reached to levels beyond anything humans have ever experienced. This was announced last Thursday. Carbon dioxide, the gas that accounts for the majority of global warming that comes from the use of fossil fuels caused by human activities, is accumulating faster than ever, said scientists from NOAA. Over the past year, we have experienced the hottest year on record, the hottest ocean temperatures on record, and seemingly endless strings of heat waves, droughts, floods, wildfires, and storms. I'd be happy to hear from folks in Europe if you are experiencing those same levels of continuing rising heat. A group of scientists from Harvard and two English universities calculated a couple of years ago that 10.2 million, let me repeat that, 10.2 million deaths can be attributed to fossil fuel use. And that's not from disasters, that's from the pollution itself. The World Food Program, which is the major relief organization, in May of this year, said that extreme weather was causing a surge in global hunger from Zambia to Afghanistan. So this, at least for me, is the underlying motivation why we shouldn't be profiting from fossil fuel and why we should be funding alternative energy as quickly as we can. I'd love to hear questions. I see a hand raised there. Stephen, please unmute and share your question or comment. We ask you to be brief because we want to get a lot of people in this.
Stephen Bruni from Cincinnati in the great state of Ohio. There were some percentages mentioned, and I'm 15% and all that, and that's very interesting. Thanks for the information. The question is, at what percentage do you think divestment needs to happen in order to change the narrative, both physically, ecologically, and not only among the churches, but among not only among the upper denominations, but let's say in the Presbyterian Church, each church can decide where they want their personal investments to go. So how do we message that? And is there a percentage we can recommend mentioning to a church? Because we can't completely divest right now because it would just cause financial collapse. but should there be a minimum divestment that we should be looking at?
Are you asking that of the people or that are from Europe? Or are you asking that for, well,
Anyone?
if any of the Europeans want to share their perspective, I know we have several of the folks that have been working on the overtures to the General Assembly with us, and maybe they'd like to answer that as well. But let's start with our guests from Europe. Anybody want to answer the percentage you recommend?
Yes. When meeting congregations, talking with congregations, listening to them, it was clear that talking about figures, percentages, tons of carbon didn't really cut it. That the arguments why we should do this, the ethical arguments why we should do it, were what was able to influence people. And by challenging people, to think, well, these are the arguments about climate change. What would you do? How can you invest your money if you're lucky enough to have it? Do you know where your money is going? Asking these kind of questions of congregations got them thinking about it. They're intelligent people, they can work this out for themselves. So talking about the duty, the Christian responsibility, and how that leads into taking financial decisions was the approach we found useful.
Okay. Anybody else? I know Fred Milligan is here, and Fred is the co-chair of the Presbyterian First Earth Care Advocacy Committee. He did go to Edinburgh for COP a couple of years back, and also is going to be going to this year's General Assembly. He co-authored the overture that we are sending to the General Assembly, which again appeals not only to the national level, but every level to local churches and congregations. Fred, how would you answer his question? If you could unmute.
I understand the question. You correct me if I'm wrong. Forget the name of the gentleman who posed it, but if I understand your question, you're saying at what level of divestment do we think the church can have an impact? How much of our money should we take out of fossil fuels in order to have an impact? Is that your question?
He's shaking his head.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, we would say, I think what we're calling for is for people to take all of our money out of fossil fuel industry. I was a bit intrigued when Mr. Peacock, Reverend Peacock, was speaking earlier about how the World Community Reformed Churches had made a definition about what is fossil fuels, and it sounded like maybe you were focusing on like the dirtiest, with tar sands and coal and some of those, and that maybe you still could invest in some quote unquote cleaner sorts of fossil fuels. And maybe that's another question for you, Philip. But I think right now our overture is asking all Presbyterians in the PCUSA to divest across the board from all products that are contributing. They are the source not only in burning of fossil fuels, but in the production of fossil fuels, in the amount of methane released, and also in other ways, as was mentioned before, in the way they pollute the air in their burning. So we just think that we should get all of our money out of fossil fuels.
I have a quick question for the folks from Scotland. My understanding is wind power has taken off in Scotland to the point that there have been some months where the electricity is basically from wind power. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes. Throughout the winter, when the wind blows and the rain falls, we are blessed with these sources of renewable energy. We even have some solar. But the developments of wind power in Scotland now exceed demand for electricity within Scotland, but larger still by far are enormous investments going into offshore wind in the North Sea. Scottish and Southern Electricity is creating a 3 gigawatt wind farm off the east coast of England, about 100 kilometers out at sea. Various other companies are doing the same. these are enormous in investments and will probably meet a significant proportion of UK's electricity demand in years to come.
Well, we hope you use it all up on electric vehicles and heat pumps quickly. Other questions and comments, again, raise your hand and we'll be happy to recognize you. Phyllis, did you have one? Please share it. Unmute.
Yes, thank you. I'm Phyllis Wendell from Greenbelt, Maryland in the US. I'm sure this is not a unique question. I bet you hear it in everything you do. But it seems to me that the best people to speak to what local churches are doing is to have people there who have successfully divested. And as someone who has just moved a significant retirement fund from where it used to be to new places, I know personally how difficult it is to find good advice, good funds in which to reinvest. And it's been a process of procrastination and anticipatory horror that I've tried to carry this out. And it's been very difficult. Some people will send me lists of maybe 10 different places that rate funds. Others have magazines that say, here are 20 from 7 different major financial investment companies. Anyway, it's a difficult process, and I don't feel that I've been very successful.
We will be providing more information on that in the months to come. Fred, do you want to mention what the Board of Pensions has for ministers as well as the foundation has for churches' investments that are in green energy and alternatives to the fossil fuel? Do you want to say something about that? No? Okay. Well, they do exist. There are a variety of ways. Another one that the Presbyterian Church has is called the Presbyterian Loan and Investment Program. And within that, they have what's called Restoring Creation loans to help churches do all these things. And so there are a variety of different ways within the church. There are also obviously many different secular and mutual funds that you might consider looking at too. We're always wary of recommending one specific thing out of concern that it may not be as successful as some of the other ones. But I think there are plenty of people that are voicing your concern, Phyllis, and we will definitely be providing that information because, again, this overture is from the very top agencies of the church down to the local individual. And our speakers also talked about banking, and that's another area that we're going to be looking at because where we put our savings in can also, unfortunately, fund the fossil fuel industry. But there are banks that avoid that, and those are ones we might want to be looking at not only for savings, but also for using credit cards. Other questions or comments? I know there are a lot of ministers here, so I can't help but think they have something to raise as a question for you all. I have another one waiting for the others to raise their hand and ask a question. Part of the criticism we have heard of our proposal to divest from fossil fuels is that it's not reformed. That is going against the Reformed tradition, that it, simply is not the way we do things. The argument is we are trying to actively engage with corporations through shareholder resolutions, conversations, etc., and try to change them rather than just saying we no longer want to deal with these folks. I'd be curious how our speakers would respond to that criticism.
I mean, I'm happy to kick off and just give a few thoughts because I think this is something we've really been wrestling with. As Adrian said, there had been quite a strong sort of speech at the General Assembly which said exactly that point. What is the point of us washing our hands of this issue if we are really going to be following our calling of faith? We need to start engaging, and the church has got a powerful voice. I think that sounds good. I think in reality, that's harder to do. I think when you start to scratch the surface of this, our voice is proportionate to the size of our investment, and it is done for us, certainly into the Church of Scotland, by investment managers who are often voting on behalf of all of their clients. Now, you can then maybe say that if all the clients are like-minded, you then have a sort of group of people coalescing around something, but there's nothing to say that all clients of an investment management firm are like-minded. So an investment manager can place votes both ways. I think certainly where we are at in the Church of Scotland, there is some benefit to using our voice collectively with other churches, but we were hearing from one of the other churches, I can't remember whether it was maybe the Quakers, I don't want to misrepresent, but people who only, they set a time limit on engagement, and they say we will attempt to engage with a company for 2 or 3 years. If we don't see any movement, we will move to divest at that point. And that is certainly something which in initial conversation our investors trust seem to be happy with. But certainly the size of the investment we hold, we've not got a seat at the table, which is really giving us much of a voice, would be my perception on that.
Anybody else would like to add anything to that?
I would like to speak to this actually. I mean, if we're speaking about reformed perspectives on this, let's start with the theological. So the theological perspective would be, can you hear me? Sorry, I see someone putting their ear up. So I'm going to speak a little loudly. Can you hear me now?
Mindy,
Okay.
can you highlight him, please?
So speaking from a distinctly Reformed Presbyterian theological perspective, I think we begin with the assertion of the sovereignty of God. And if God is sovereign over all, that means that all aspects of life have to relate to the divine. There is no part of life which can be excluded from this. So we at no point of time can say it's just business, or business is business, and religious or our Christian life of discipleship is separate from this. So that's the first principle. The second is, I would believe that the present economic system that we are living in is actually causing the death and destruction of the planet and people who live on it. So there's a much wider horizon here. I would like to see capitalism go. This is not working for us. Particularly speaking as someone who's coming from the global south, it has not worked for us for a long time. Certain policies were put into place that actually pushed countries from the global south into further neoliberalism. So this is the first perspective. Second perspective, what is our horizon? So our broader horizon is that this economic system is not working. But we need to have a second horizon of what can we do in our everyday praxis and our everyday struggle for justice. And this is exactly where the conversation is now with the question of ethical investments. The point that I'm going to make is now, under the first horizon of the sovereignty of God, the second distant horizon of the economic system not working, our third horizon of what we do in everyday praxis is where perhaps we have to see how this horizon matches the other two. So we have to talk about whether this particular industry is actually servicing the cause of people, whether it's servicing the cause of the planet or not. And then it's a little further, right? We have to scrutinize every single company, because the company we're investing in, they themselves may not be following, an oil company, but they may be investing in an oil company. And I think we need to then also follow the money and see where this is going. So this requires a very, very much, a lot of hard work from our part to scrutinize our everyday praxis as disciples and as communities of faith to see where we're moving on this.
Philip, I know the World Communion of Reformed Churches recently issued a study document, a report that ties climate, environmental justice with overall justice issues. It took some time to develop that. It is available on your website. Maybe you could put a link to that in the chat so people
Sure.
have that available, and we will also include that in the resources with the recording later on. But I think you would agree that is well worth people's attention, right? I don't want to say it's exactly, but it's a nice reform parallel to the papal encyclicals dealing with this. So I think we would benefit from everybody looking at that. Again, we are all enriched from one another, so it's wonderful if we can share such things. Other questions or comments from people?
Bruce, there's a question.
I'm sorry. Oh, yes, please. Stephen.
It's not so much a question as a comment. Having been Catholic and having been now a Presbyterian, those are traditions, and there's Reformed tradition, there's other traditions, but God's mandates exceed any human tradition, and that's what Reformed tradition is, and Catholicism is, and all those other denominations. So I think that I believe the MRTI and the Presbyterian tradition, that organization, does make a good faith effort to try to get these larger companies to change their practices and other things, the way they do things, especially when it comes to ethical issues, and also, trying to find cleaner ways to do things. But eventually, when they no longer do that, as the Bible says, you stamp your feet on the ground if they will not hear your message, and you leave. In this case, we don't have the option to leave because the planet is we can't leave the planet. So I think biblically mandated that at some point, any tradition needs to give way to the gospel mandates of care for the planet, care for the people, and love one another. So that would be my answer to those people that ask that. There is a limit to our authority when it comes to Reformed tradition. We must always bow to the authority of the divine creator.
I don't think anybody's going to argue with, each tradition enriches overall Christianity. And it is exciting when there are commonalities and mutual understandings. Philip and I were in Germany a few years ago for the General Council of the World Communion of Reformed Churches. And we, in that tradition, formally adopted what was called the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification. And that had previously been agreed to with the Lutherans and the Roman Catholics. The Reformed community came on board with that. And as Phillips has mentioned, one of the aspects of our tradition is a strong emphasis on justice. And that was incorporated in the WCRC's comments about the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification, that corporate sense had to be included. So I don't think we are far apart. Actually, we understand better and are rich by one another, but ultimately it's not so much what we say, but what we do. So we don't want to be seen as critical of people who have been working on this for many years. People from the Advisory Committee on Social Witness Policy, the Mission Through Responsible Investment, have put in real time and tried to make a real difference. Now it's a question of a sense of urgency. With the crisis escalating, getting hotter and hotter, more and more people suffering and dying, is this the best way for the church to use its funds, or are there better alternative ways of doing it? We have limited time and staff for that.
Can I just
Sure.
respond? I'm very impressed by Philip's radicalism. The voice of the South needs to be heard, and it can help drive our agenda. When he says new liberal capitalism is responsible for economic and ecological crises, I think we can only agree. And I just put in the chat a publication from the Conference of European Churches, Every Part of Creation Matters, which came out about a year ago, and says roughly the same thing from a European perspective, that we have seen continued economic growth deliver great prosperity for some in Europe, but not for others. And we've seen continued environmental damage. And we are aware that that happens not just within countries, within Europe, but happens globally. So the radical agenda that Philip is espousing, I think is challenging, particularly for those who continue to benefit from neoliberal capitalism, but it's that voice from the South that can really help us reshape our thinking and our theology.
Thank you. I would add one of the last writings by Moltmann, who just recently died, was published in a South African journal, and it was an essay that lifted up theology and the climate crisis. And he wanted to also add the importance of us recognizing the creation being impacted beyond humanity. You know, huge numbers of animals and plants are quickly becoming extinct. And that should be as important to us in many ways as human beings. All need to be cherished. All are part of God's creation. Fred, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I just wanted to follow up on Steve's comment from a few minutes ago. And Steve, yeah, I think we totally agree, that when quote unquote established practice that has served us well, perhaps in many ways, has reached its limits, at what point do we say we must move beyond what has been established practice of the past? And one of the issues with this established practice in our specific case here in the PCUSA is that our mission responsibility through investment process only focuses on company practices, does not focus on the impact of company products. So there's no attention to the product of an industry and how it is impacting the world as a part of our own, because our process is focused all together on engagement about company practices. And what we're calling for in our current overture is to focus now on the products of the fossil fuel industry. Thanks.
Helpful comment. Thank you, Fred. Other questions or comments, friends? I know we've exceeded the hour. We can go a little longer, but we do want to try to keep this fairly tight so that people might make use of it. And again, we know this does not exhaust the topic. And so if there are written reports or materials that are available online, I'll include the Moltmann one, but let us know, send them to us, and we will include that with the posting of the recording. Any other comments? I have written an article for Presbyterian Outlook, which has many different hyperlinks, and we will be sharing that along with a lot of other material. We mentioned we will be doing an upcoming webinar looking at investments and banking. I think the Church of Scotland folks mentioned they were impressed by when Bill McKimmon addressed people there in Scotland. Well, we happen to have a video by Bill to this year's General Assembly. He was baptized Presbyterian, and he was kind enough to give us a little video, and that is currently on the Presbyterians for Earth Care website. I really liked the United Reformed Church comment about talking about a climate emergency. I'm not sure that particular language has been used among American Presbyterians, but it does stress really the emergency nature of this, and that would be something helpful for us to consider. We have another overture related to the fossil fuel one coming to this assembly dealing with plastic pollution. The fossil fuel industry is always looking for other ways to make use of their products, and they have been doing a very successful job in promoting plastics. And that in turn, there you go. So you can see them, the removal of investments in subsidies for fossil fuels, and then on becoming free from plastic pollution and the adoption of sustainable peace pledge. That middle one on plastic pollution, the latest studies are not only concerned about we now have more plastic than the entire living creatures on the planet have been produced, and it doesn't go away quickly, as we know. But the recent research has been lifting up the problem of microplastics and how these are getting into all of our bodies and then causing serious heart and stroke and other very serious health issues. So all the more for us to try to get out of that. Any other comments before we close?
Bruce, Russell had his hand up, I believe. He just
I'm
didn't
sorry I
have
missed you,
his-
Russell. Can we hear from you?
Russell, unmute, please.
Thank you, Mindy, for seeing Russell. Is he still there? Go ahead and talk, Russell. If you're unmuted, you will come up to the top of the screen when you do.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Russell Smith. I'm in Ottawa, Canada. My question was, how
We
much,
can't hear you.
how do we measure the effect of our withdrawal of our resources on the actual production of fossil fuels?
I welcome many of our speakers to respond to that.
I can give a quick response, Russell. I guess for us, the idea of our money having an impact on the companies that we had invested in, we had got to the stage where we didn't feel they were listening anyway. So the best thing for us to do was to do what we felt was the ethical thing and to withdraw our money to stop investing in them. We weren't perhaps expecting that they would be seriously damaged by that. We have a smaller portfolio than other organizations. So it wasn't really at that stage. We had come to the end of really expecting that they would listen to our money. And we felt that actually ethically, we just needed to take our money out of their organizations so that then we could ethically start to challenge them in other ways. So rather than investing in them, we would be clear of that. And just to respond earlier on, someone said about at what percent. And for us, the 10% margin for us, I guess we could probably just say it was like a margin of error, Russell, if that kind of isn't too glib. It was that we really wanted to disinvest from any company which was involved in fossil fuel production, but we were aware that sometimes that's not very straightforward or very simple for some companies to work out. We want them to be more transparent, but just in case there were sometimes blips, and we were giving ourselves a 10% margin for some companies that are maybe in that process also of divesting before we would withdraw from them. If that's a hopeful and hopefully a helpful response, Russell.
Thank you, as far as it goes.
We're all working on it. Other questions or comments? Well, I think we can bring it to a close if I don't see. I'd like to ask the presenters if they have any final words. Any encouragement for your American cousins? We'd welcome any other comments that you think would be important to share as we close the program. Speak now or wait for the next webinar.
I would just thank you very much for your hospitality in inviting us, and say I think the great resource that you have, of course, for your people and your congregations, that are promoting this debate. The church itself has investments, but the members of your congregations, through their bank accounts, if their pension funds, and if they're lucky enough to have savings and investments, will be hugely greater. And putting these issues into the minds of congregations to say, what can you do? What questions can you ask? Can you kick up a fuss with whoever's managing your pension or your investments, to let them know, can have a huge cumulative impact. So go for it.
Thank you, Adrian. Anybody else like to offer a closing comment? Mindy, you have any other slides, or this it? Well, it wouldn't be a church meeting without passing the offering plate.
Yeah.
This is, Mindy works part-time, the rest of us are volunteers, and we're very grateful for donations. We are helping fund Fred being able to go to Salt Lake City to be a visible presence at that national meeting in just a couple of weeks. Whether you give us funds or you give us your prayers, all of them are appreciated. And I think what I'd like to do, people did mention the COP meeting in Edinburgh just a few years ago, and I thought I would close with a special prayer hymn that was written for that meeting by an American Presbyterian hymn writer who is in the new All Is Welcome Scottish hymnal supplement. And this is a woman named Carolyn Winfrey Gillette, who I'm happy to claim as my wife. A Korean American pastor did a nice recording of it. It's called The Climate is Changing. And so I will make use of my screen sharing privileges. Let's see. Nope. I don't think I can do it for some reason. We'll just add it to a link for the posting of the recording. Any other final thoughts? Otherwise, let us close with a brief prayer. Loving God, we thank you for your church around the world, for those represented here this time, for their dedication in their care of your creation. We pray you continue to unite us as we seek to love one another, to love our neighbors, and then to love your creation. Help us to be a blessing as you have blessed us so much, for we pray it in Christ our Lord's name. Amen. Thank you all. Blessings. Take care.